All right, all right. We are here. My name is Rashad Robinson. I'm the president of Color of Change, and I am joined by the incredible Kimberle Crenshaw. And this is the first in our series, Black History Now. Black History Now is a program of Color of Change rooted in our storytelling and campaign advocacy work. All around the country, we are seeing attacks on Black history, on the full teaching of American history, because when Black history is taught and when people understand Black history and understand the full range of American history, so many things are possible. And as a result, forces have aligned. Those that have consistently been working to bring this country backwards, those who have consistently wanting to silence the voices of everyday people fighting for a better tomorrow. And that has taken on many different forms. And at Color of Change, we've been working to mobilize our members to fight back, both taking on corporations and corporate power who enable these efforts, working to highlight these issues in the media, partnering on the ground with local organizations and training those who want to run campaigns and engage. And of course, being in conversation with those that have been at the forefront, those who have been leading and those who have been pioneers in this effort. And I am so incredibly grateful for you, Kimberle, joining us in this conversation, our very first one. And it feels so fitting because you have been at the forefront of so many of these conversations, both in leading the African American Policy Forum, your work at UCLA and Columbia, your writing, all of the thought leadership you have provided both in this country and around the world, from even having your work cited in the South African Constitution. You have been an inspiration to me and to so many, and there's this saying that we oftentimes talk about giving people their flowers. And I just want to say, if I could grow a garden, I would make sure that we had it for you. So I just want to start off with that. I also want to start off this conversation by, kind of giving us some language. You have been so instrumental in giving us and being part of the work to give us frameworks and language, from critical race theory to intersectionality, ways for us to both understand and see this work, for us to think about our role in the world, to think about how to look at the law and how to both understand how to use it and when to know its limitations. And so if you could give us just some understanding and grounding in what are we talking about and what are they talking about when these conversations about critical race theory and intersectionality and the fight back and pushback we are currently seeing.
Well, thank you. First of all, Rashad, I'm just so honored to be here, to be part of this magnificent project that you all have, and just to be in partnership with Color of Change. We've been talking about this since it started. There are two people who I could call up and say, what the heck is happening? And Janae Nelson was one, and you were the other. So I think it's first important to recognize that there's critical race theory proper, which is the study of how law facilitates and rationalizes deep racial inequalities. It has from the beginning. This country was built on theft of labor, theft of land, and quite frankly, theft of Black women's reproductive choices, right? So property, the second most valuable property besides real estate when this country was founded, was property and people. And that basically came from Black women. So we have an understanding that the foundations of this country are grounded in a racial project. And critical race theory is the study of how law helped to make the fiction of race real. There is the reality that race isn't real, but racism is. and racism is deeply embedded. So law helps us understand how these things have been, how the material dimensions of racial inequality are created, how it's insulated, how it's made to appear to be natural, neutral, unchangeable. These are the elements of racial inequality. I'm going to cite for a moment my new favorite movie, Woman King. Yeah? And if you haven't seen it, you better. Yeah. But I'm going to just paraphrase, there was a line that says, you know, the way to ensure the domination of people is to first make it impossible to think that they have a right to be free. And the law was part of that project in saying Black people don't have the right to be free. They don't have a right to learn. They don't have a right to read and to understand their condition. And they don't have a right to testify about their actual condition. So much of what we're experiencing now, we've seen in the past. Yep. And part of our project as young post-civil rights students going to law school was to understand that. What role does law play in making this obvious post-slavery, post-segregation society appear to be just the way things have to be? If we can name that prism, and if we can create a practice of reading the situation for what it is, not what it's told to be, not what people tell it is, but what it actually is, then that's the pathway to liberation. So that's what critical race theory proper is.
And so intersectionality is like a piece of critical race theory.
It is.
Yes.
And many people don't know that. I don't know if I actually want to say it really, because people haven't. They started coming after intersectionality and then shifted to come after critical race theory. So like, oh, do I protect the one or whatever? But it's important to know that intersectionality is a part of critical thinking about how law facilitates inequality. And it's important to recognize, and you know, it is the case that those of us who were born mid-20th century and later understood law to be the great liberator. You know, it's the referee. It's the one that says, foul, you can't do that. You can't discriminate. And for a short period of our history, one could expect the Supreme Court to be at least friendly, if not, you know, fully embracing our aspirations for a short period of time.
For a short period of time.
Short.
Yes.
But for the rest of the time, before and after, law in its first instance was the institution that said, actually, your enslavement is okay. Law was a thing that said, because you are enslavable people, because we did this to you, you can never be a citizen of the United States. So what gets done to us becomes who we are. We were enslaved, so we became slaves. So that's what critical race theory is looking at. How does the Constitution facilitate this, and then laws built on that? Now, intersectionality builds out of critical race theory. Intersectionality asks, we understand a little bit about how race functions, but how does race function across other axes of domination? How does race come together with gender? Now, there are easy ways of telling the story. One of the stories that I got my whole start in thinking about intersectionality was a case called DeGraff and Reed versus General Motors. And it's basically a case where a Black woman wants to move up through the ranks to the better paying jobs in General Motors. But the problem is that the workforce, like many, was segregated by race and segregated by gender. So there were Black jobs, but those were for the men. And there were women's jobs, but those were for white women. And so Emma DeGraff and Reed said, hey, look, I'm being discriminated against as a Black woman. And the court said, no, you can't prove that, because General Motors does hire Black people, just they're all men. And they do hire women, they are just all white. And the court thought, aren't we being smart? Right? We are basically saying,
Yep.
no. You don't get a chance to come in here and combine two causes of action to make a case of discrimination. For us to let you do that would be giving you special treatment. Now, of course, Black women were the only ones that had to put these two causes of action together to actually tell a legible story about discrimination. And, the courts just dismissed it. So my goal was to try to figure out what kind of remedial strategy, and I mean remedial, like they were backwards, couldn't understand what was obvious. I needed to give them some help. So intersectionality was that help. It was simply look at an analogy. There are intersections. You go through them every day. Traffic is going north to south, east to west. Think about that traffic as racism and sexism. Intersectionality is what happens to people who are caught between both of these axes of domination. And not to address them is to discriminate against them. So that's where intersectionality originally came from. And of course, it's applicable to all sorts of axes of domination. It's not just Black women. It's not just race and gender. It can be race, gender identity, class, national origin, ability. All of these things can intersect. The problem is that law hadn't anticipated that. So the point was to try to articulate and argue for law to broaden and deepen in order for its commitments to create equity for everybody to really be realizable.
And for the forces that don't want equity for everyone, right, this becomes dangerous, right?
Yes.
And there has to be a project to silence this, right? And
Yes.
and whether it's silencing frameworks that move us forward or silencing Black history becomes sort of the very worst of white history.
Which is exactly why this moment is so vexed, right? Because just think about where we were in 2020. 2020, we had the most massive demonstrations for racial justice ever. 50 states, majority white people coming out to demand racial justice. So we were
Right, and many people thought the best we could do was clap outside of windows.
Yes, and here
now people are out in the streets,
Here
right?
they're out in the streets.
Yeah,
So I want to ask you,
yeah.
what happened, right? Because this was part of the upward trajectory. This is part of the narrative of as people see the injustice and demand concepts to help them understand it, the idea is that we move closer and closer to the promises. But something happened after 2020 that has something to do with misinformation, disinformation.
Absolutely.
And I see the media as being an enabler of it. Now, I know you do a lot of work on helping people to understand media literacy. So what do we need to understand to figure out how we got here from 2020?
Well, I think one thing that's important about the media is that there were no good old days, right? Sometimes there's a story the media likes to tell that we are now in a age of misinformation and disinformation, but the lie about Black people that was at the founding of this country, right, fueled by media, fueled by storytellers, and whether it's the marches into wars, the ways in which tax policies have been defended, the ways in which decisions about who's educated and not educated, the media has always played a role. And it's been the responsibility in many ways for those communities that are fighting for a better tomorrow to build their own infrastructure. And no one has been better at that than Black people. I think Black people in so many ways have invented the whole idea of independent media, have invented the idea of independent film, have invented the idea of independent infrastructure. Sometimes because we had to build things because we couldn't access what other folks had. And sometimes we built things that were just unique and focused on us. And so I do think that as we think about the information environment, One is it's not an accident. It's not a car accident that just sort of happened. We are dealing with an environment fueled by Silicon Valley and fueled by infrastructures that we don't control. And so all of the infrastructure that works against us is not infrastructure that's controlled by the right, but it's infrastructure that benefits from decisions made by the right. And so if you think about the lack of transparency, out of the algorithms, you think about the business models and the incentive structures of not just the biggest platforms in Silicon Valley, but even the small ones. If you think about the immunity that platforms have over the content and the ways in which the choices about what get amplified and what doesn't, you start to sort of understand what can be at play. But once again, there was no good old days, right? This was always at play in different ways. And now we are dealing with sort of gasoline that's been poured over a match, and we're getting sort of a different result. That, I think, once we understand that, now we have to figure out what do we do about it. Right. And I think what we have to sort of recognize is that there's absolute work that has to be done from a public policy perspective to hold, those accountable that proliferate this mis and disinformation, and to not allow there to be immunity behind how these platforms are designed. Right? Our cars are not safe because of the benevolence of the auto industry. Our meat is not safe because big ag care so much about us, right? These corporations are held accountable, and there's infrastructure that ensures, and there's consequences when they don't. And right now we have people who call themselves engineers that get to build things and then have no consequence for when those things that they build fall and hurt people. And that actually has to change. But we will always lose in the back rooms if we don't have people lined up at the front door.
That's right.
And so one thing that I think is incredibly important for anyone who cares about the information environment is that we need more people invested and more people involved. We just released the Black Tech Agenda at Color of Change, and have been doing a lot of work to build energy and visibility and power over the type of demands that are going to be necessary across a range of different areas to hold accountable the tech industry. But that means holding our elected officials accountable, because we shouldn't have to go to billionaires and beg them to do something better. We shouldn't have to beg folks who are building the next platform to think about civil rights. Civil rights shouldn't be something that they get to choose off of a menu of the things they care about. They should actually have to care about it. And when they don't live up to those rules, there should be consequences. And so, to the extent that the technology that can bring us into the future is dragging us into the past, and it's not an accident, there's a role for all of us to play in that effort. And I think as you look at sort of what has happened around critical race theory, as you think about what has happened around some of the backlash to racial justice, you can look squarely at the ways in which our information environment has put its hand on the scale. People talk about polarization, but polarization is when there's like two warring sides. Yeah. Polarization is not when there are all these forces putting their hands on the side of forces that are trying to make some people invisible. Make some people not have rights and access. And that is what we are dealing with. And that is why the fight for racial justice is so important. And the thing I will sort of end with on this piece is that, it did become very dangerous to see all those people out in the streets, to see multiracial coalitions of people believing that systemic racism existed, right? That is dangerous because racial justice is our superpower.
Yeah.
Right?
And a majoritarian value.
And a majoritarian value.
The majority of people support racial justice.
Yes.
Exactly.
And so, and the power of racial justice, not just as, I think, the most clear particularly when you apply an intersectional framework to it, the most clear way to evaluate whether or not what we won was actually worth winning and was actually a truly real win, but it's actually the most powerful motivating force, right? People were clapping outside of windows and then they turned out into the streets.
Yeah.
And racial justice made that possible. So if I'm on the other side, of course, I'm going to do everything I possibly can to attack racial justice. The problem is that we can sometimes have people that want to be in allyship but not solidarity. People who sometimes want to see racial justice as charity and not racial justice as strategy. And racial justice isn't just the moral thing you do to be out of the way of the sort of black and brown folks. It's not just the thing you do when you're a good person. It is the thing you do when you want to win.
That's right.
Because it is the driver that allows us to unlock all the potential power to save our planet, make our economy function well, make sure that jobs are safe and there for all of us, make sure that women's reproductive choices are protected and valued, and so much more. When racial justice is at the forefront, there are so many victories that happen for so many issues that people don't even think are connected to racial justice.
So the million-dollar question then, since that is abundantly 100% irrefutably true, why is it that we're at a moment in time when the democracy is really on the ropes right now? Racial grievance is the unspoken but dominant force in driving people to think that the country has been stolen from them, to think that aggression in the name of defending their country is legitimate. Why is it that this is happening? And yet our politicians, our elected officials, and our media are loath to explore and reveal the connections between white supremacy and the unraveling of our democracy. So we're about to have another hearing, the last hearing.
January 6th.
It's the January 6th hearings. I was shocked about how hard it has been for the conversation about January 6th to really focus on the fact that actually this has happened before. We have had coups in this country. We've had violent takeovers of the government. We have seen a faction in this country decide to break the country rather than share the country. We've seen the creation of a republic based on the idea, the first republic in the world, based on the idea of white supremacy. Explicitly so. That's what the Confederacy was. Yet, we don't teach it in the schools. We have pursued a strategy of reconciliation above all. It has mandated the forgetting of what the Civil War is about. At this point, less than 10% of high school seniors can identify slavery as the cause of the Civil War. And they think that we have too much critical race theory in the school rather than too little, right? And we know that the effort to re-narrativize what happened when the country was broken was successful, basically because the lost cause became the story that gets told in history books pretty much everywhere for the first 80 years after the Civil War. So we get the fact that telling lies about our history, we get the fact that allowing our country to continue to nurse the idea that the Civil War was fought for good and moral purposes. We allow for history books to be dictated by a faction in this country, and yet we don't remember enough about that to see it happening right now, right? So it's happening as we sit here, and we have now our president, who was willing to say that we're in a proto-fascist moment, but not willing to say that white supremacy had everything to do with it. We have our elected officials who are willing to say, come out and vote, but not willing to say that the efforts to suppress our vote, to gerrymander our districts, it's a page right out of the history that we're not teaching. So what I have been trying to desperately understand is, what am I seeing that they're not seeing? What am I feeling that they're not feeling? Yeah. What am I afraid about that they're not afraid about? And why are they not afraid about this?
Well, first of all, you're always ahead. And I think that's important in this conversation, because I was surprised when we got to the fact that all the Democratic candidates were saying white supremacy on stage, which was a marked difference from Democratic presidential debates prior. And that's a result of movement building.
Right.
That's a movement building victory that those on the stage felt like in order to stay on the stage, they had to at least name a thing, even if they wouldn't apply it.
And even if they don't understand what it is, right? So it's great to say white supremacy or I'm against structural racism.
But you spent enough time on
and then they don't know what it is. But
but you spent enough time on Capitol Hill to know that people are oftentimes talking about things that they don't.
It's a dangerous thing. Because they throw it out there. It does more to galvanize the right against us, right? Yeah. So they hear this white supremacy stuff, structural racism. Oh, this is indoctrination. We better get our act together. So now in almost 25 states, there are laws that prohibit the teaching of racial history in any way that suggests that there's current responsibility for past harms, in any way that makes anyone feel bad, in ways that suggest that structural racism actually is real. So it created this backlash. I'm all for, going into battle if the people who are the front lines stay on the front lines. But it's another thing when they throw the stuff out there, and then when the backlash comes, they're the first to disappear.
Yeah.
Right?
Yep.
And so now here we are doing this work of racial justice without some of the deep pockets, without the politicians, without the media. We're basically doing this work on our own. Yeah. So here's a question that comes out of that. We've talked about this a little bit before. We are moving in a period where now affirmative action is going to be on the chopping block, right? And there have been times in the past that we have tried to figure out how to galvanize the masses and various assets and allies to help fight for racial justice, in particular affirmative action. And we've been told on a number of occasions, well, what you do is you learn a lesson from the most successful strategies and campaigns. And one of the successful strategies and campaigns was marriage equality. So just do what LGBTQIA organizations do and you'll be fine. So tell us what you think about that advice, that analogy. What does it lift up? What does it obscure? And what should we do about it?
Intersectionality. Wow. So first and foremost, intersectionality, because some of us live in both those bodies. And it's not LGBT or race for so many. And so I think that first and foremost. The second is we have to be very careful about models, right? I love a palm tree. I was just in LA for some time. Hopefully I have a bit of a little red. I love that. A little bit, right? And so love LA. I also love New York, which is home, and I love Central Park. A palm tree will not grow in Central Park, and a lot of trees will. And oftentimes we are trying to plant a palm tree in Central Park when we try to apply models that actually do not grow in certain environments. And so I do not think that it can be a one-to-one framework. I mean, my years of success building media campaigns and winning a lot of victories while at GLAD. If I just was gonna like take that framework and apply it to Color of Change and then just say, oh, we're all done, let's wrap up. It just doesn't work that way. But I do think that there are bigger lessons to understand about how people show up, how people stay invested, and what does it look like to have people in solidarity in a fight. And so the story that really sort of resonates for me is that in 2004, 13 anti-gay ballot measures passed all around the country. The right wing used it as a tool to help mobilize folks for George Bush's reelection campaign. It was a campaign led by Ken Melman, the deputy campaign manager for George W. Bush. They went into black churches and they tried to slice off percentages of the black vote around these. And 13 states passed these anti-gay ballot measures. In states where marriage equality was not even on the agenda, and people said, oh no, we're not working towards marriage. We're not even hoping that folks would go away with these anti-gay ballot measures. But it was a right-wing tactic at sort of drumming up outrage, and the left largely turned its back. It was also a backlash to Massachusetts starting to marry couples, and many mayors around the country beginning to marry couples without sort of the laws passing. People might not remember, but Gavin Newsom, as the mayor of San Francisco, started marrying couples, and he was uninvited to the Democratic National Convention. Could anyone imagine Gavin Newsom today being uninvited to the Democratic National Convention? And so he was uninvited, and people were outraged when Kerry lost and those ballot measures passed, and they blamed the LGBT movement and said they overstepped. You should have asked for civil unions and domestic partnerships. You went too far. But the movement actually kept moving and pushing and had a larger demand. And we can have a whole set of conversations about leading with marriage and who that prioritizes and who it doesn't. But I'm talking about sort of the frameworks of how movement building can create new litmus tests. Because think about the powerful framework that marriage equality meant for a whole new generation of people who identified with progressive politics through that framework, who saw themselves as queer or as allies or in with family members and wanted to fight and saw that as a litmus test in ways that they may not have seen the economy or other issues, and then became part of the left as a result of actually recognizing relationship recognition and all the ways in which the right was not good on those issues. And people kept fighting. And some states did domestic partnerships, and some states did civil unions, and some states moved to marriage. And then you get to 2008, and California takes away marriage equality. So there was still backlash because it was not a straight line, because sometimes when you win, you also lose along the way. And part of building movements is recognizing that and inviting new people into that journey. And so we get to 2008, and President Obama's elected, and marriage is taken away in 2000 from couples who were getting ready to marry, who hadn't quite gotten there. And then you see the movement continue. Not say civil unions, but continue to push. And I remember when I left GLAD in 2011 to come to Color of Change, I remember for a number of reasons, because New York was starting to marry couples, and this is the state I grew up in, and I could have never imagined growing up that this state would have marriage equality. Also because at GLAD, Ken Melman is now out of the closet and in the GLAD office talking about conservative media and LGBT politics, and I just felt like a weird sort of framework, because more people will join you as you win, and pretend like maybe they were always there. But also, I think about something that the racial justice movement oftentimes lacks, in the ways in which generational wealth gets built, the ways in which people have access to resources. Our movement is oftentimes relying on resources from donors who don't have as much solidarity with our cause.
That's right.
And the LGBT movement was oftentimes funded by people who were used to losing. Openly gay people who lost standing when they came out, lost family members when they came out, lost people that they loved to a disease this country turned its back on. And they knew that losing on 2 years or 4-year cycles still meant that they had to fight and push and demand the things that they actually wanted. So if there's anything we take, it's not that we apply sort of some strategies that take out race and the role of race. It's actually we bump up the role of race to sort of understand what we have to demand and expect from people who say they are our friends and in solidarity with us, because those that oftentimes have the most to lose will do the least, and those that have the least to lose, because we have already lost a lot, will fight like hell. But if people want to stand with us, if people want to be on our side, then it goes back to recognizing that racial justice is not the force that we bench in the fourth quarter of the game. It's the force that we put as much energy behind. It's the player that we put on the court, because at the end of the day, I believe that it is our force multiplier for change. And if we learn anything from other movements, I think in many ways we have to sort of learn how folks show up and don't show up when these fights come. And that sort of leads me to my next question for you, in terms of, you always knew this backlash was coming in some way, shape, or form. I remember having these conversations with you. And I'm interested in sort of how you sort of see the cavalry. What has the cavalry look like? I also want you to talk a little bit about sort of similar to the story I just told, like, how have people talked about this issue, and how have you had to navigate this as people have looked at this as preventing them from winning something else, rather than as a framework to actually leverage, people playing defense instead of playing offense?
Yeah. Well, you said something that just when we started, that whenever there's forward momentum, whenever there is reform or progress, there's inevitably a backlash. Golly, it was 30 years ago. My very, very first critical race theory article was called "Race Reform and Retrenchment," and the whole point was, we often make some reform. Sometimes it's even symbolic, but that fuels a backlash, partly because of the symbolic dimension of the reform. And when that backlash happens, it becomes that much harder to push against it, because the backlash often isn't articulated in the honest way that it's being experienced. Like this backlash, people aren't really saying, we support Derek Chauvin killing George Floyd. They're not really saying we want to go back to segregation and enslavement. They're not saying it directly, but they're saying it indirectly when they say "Make America Great Again." Like, exactly when was that you're talking about? When they're saying, I believe that you're telling your stories, your demands for equity violate my civil rights. That is an argument that came directly out of the response to the desegregation movement. Yep. When people used to say, well, my having to serve you violates my civil rights, right? Yep. Or my having to send my little girl to an integrated school.
All those evangelical schools.
All in,
yep.
And I went to one, so I know they weren't happy for me to be up in the mix. But these are occasions, little did they know. Thank you for making it clear what was going on. These are moments in which the deep threads that connect our history to this current moment are being rehearsed, reproduced, unleashed again. I sometimes call this like our own Halloween. There are so many episodes. It's like, when is this franchise going to be over, right? It's over and over and over again. Why do people keep going, right? It's the same story. So I anticipated the backlash. did not anticipate how effective it was going to be, because I thought it was so obvious. I mean, they told us what they were doing. They told us, we want to rebrand and recode critical race theory.
Yep.
So anytime people read something that they don't like, they say, oh, that's that critical race theory. I mean, they told us what they were going to do. So my hunch, my thought, in my rational world, I thought, well, if they're telling us that they are putting together every piece of the social justice apparatus in this container to attack. So it wasn't just critical race theory, it wasn't just 1619, it was diversity, it was implicit bias, it was structural racism, it was equal opportunity. They told us, if your kid is reading any of these ideas, it is critical race theory and you should attack it. And so even though the majority of people who are foaming at the mouth in these school board meetings couldn't define critical race theory if their lives depended on it, it didn't keep them from running to the school boards with their pitchforks demanding blood from somebody. Mm-hmm. Now, my hunch was when people saw that then they would go, oh, all right, they're talking about us. They're talking about our kids.
Yeah.
They're talking about our history. They're basically trying to make racism unspeakable. And so when racism becomes unspeakable, the disparities that it produces have no source other than, I guess, us, right?
Yep. Well,
when you can't tell the story of the history that created our segregated neighborhoods, or the history that created wealth disparities, health disparities, when you can't talk about the institutionalized ways that just everyday practices continue to reproduce racial harms, when our kids don't learn about it, what inference is there to draw?
Yeah.
Who is responsible? What are we to do about it? So it just so happens that when you make racism unspeakable, you make equality unachievable. Because what you've basically said is the problem is in you. It's not in our history.
That's a word.
It's not in our institutions. And we're not going to let you talk about it. So I guess I've just been surprised about how hard it is to talk inside of our communities to say, you don't have to be in a critical race theory course to know that what they're attacking is the wisdom, the knowledge to survive a society that is not a colorblind society. So now I've been telling people, okay, let's talk about what's really at stake.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the way that you are a critical race theorist. So when you are driving and you see the sirens, hear the sirens and see the flashing lights in your rearview mirror, and you put your hands at 10 o'clock and 2 o'clock on the steering wheel, you are practicing critical race theory. When you sit down and give your kids the talk because you want to enhance and increase their chances of survival, you are practicing critical race theory. When you're sitting in that office meeting and you said something and it's like you didn't say anything until the white person says it. And you go, huh, didn't I just say that? You are practicing critical race theory. So our knowledge, our awareness, our ability to navigate the world that we live in, the world that's shaped by anti-Black racism, institutions that are infused with it, all of this knowledge is what is at stake when they come after critical race theory. So one of the things that I tell people, Rashad, is, look, when we really care about making non-toxic environments, when we really care about going into these institutions and taking out all that horrible stuff that we built the country with, we value the knowledge about where that stuff is. We value the people who have expertise in it. We encourage people to understand where the toxicity comes from so we can remove it. When we recognize we have asbestos, for example, in our institutions, We want people to tell us where we're vulnerable. Give us the floor plan so we can see where it is. Tell us how to take it out. We don't say,
Actually, not always, right? We had to have lawsuits around that, right? There had to be,
And why did the lawsuits win? The lawsuits won because people realized it's stupid. It makes no sense to say that the problem with asbestos is saying the word asbestos.
Yes.
The problem with getting rid of it is the people who say, I think you have a problem. But that's what we do with race and racism. The people who have the expertise are the ones who are now accused of being the racist. And if we don't step up and say, nah, son, that's not going to work. You're not taking away from us a century of progress. We're not going to let this happen on our watch. If we don't step up, we're passing on to the next generation a situation that's worse than the one we received.
Yeah. It is so interesting, and it's such I think a valuable invitation, right, to folks who may not have seen this as the fight that they need to take on, right? Another invitation that I would like to offer in the same vein is that the same people that are trying to ban Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks from our schools are the same people that did not want girls to learn math, don't want gay teachers, that don't want evolution taught. And it's the same political project, and we actually have to be deeply aligned at going after that project. We have to
connect the dots.
We have to connect the dots, because we can all go back into our individual corners and think that we are fighting these battles here and there while they have consolidated infrastructure and consolidated capacity and resources, and will deploy it one by one against all of us. And so what would it look like of people of good faiths, of all races, of all backgrounds, who want to fight for a better tomorrow, to recognize that we actually have to fight together if we're going to win, and that we have to fight by welcoming more people into this fight, but we also have to fight by taking on our opponent's infrastructure, and we have to dismantle that infrastructure. And so, yes, there is the aspirational work of a better tomorrow, and then there is the hardcore work of holding enablers accountable, of making it like not a profit center, of creating real world consequences for this work. And that has to be the invitation of people who actually want to wake up 5, 10, 15 years from now and believe that the kind of society that we are living in, a potential project towards a multiracial democracy, has a fighting chance.
Yeah. You know, I think that our starting position, and you said this earlier, we have to be prepared not to carve out, set aside, marginalize, or unspeak racism.
Yep.
We can't see it as yesterday's news. We can't see it as that thing that we can't win with if we take it on. And we can't see it as something that only impacts a few people in our community. And frankly, over the last 15 or 20 years, anti-racism has lost much of the capital that it once had. If we're not able to recapture the recognition that the key way in which our society fell apart before was over racism, if we're not able to see that this sense of entitlement and the ability to do some of the worst things imaginable to a democracy, basically take away people's right to participate in it, take away people's right to learn about it, take away people's right to protest. We're not able to see how that backlash to George Floyd made possible the legislation in Florida that is effectively don't say gay. If we're not able to see how the takeover of the Supreme Court, because of the fears of its progressivism on racial justice, enabled this Supreme Court to then take away women's right to choose. If we're not able to see how the platforms for the right-wing drift into a proto-fascist country was made possible by the unreconstructed investment in a community, in a country that was built on the idea that this was a white project. If we can't talk about that, then we're not really going to be able to deal with any of these things in the kind of coalitional way that we need. So for me, when you said this is the possibility of actually building meaningful winning coalitions, you can't circumnavigate the origins of this country. You have to go through it. You build on it, right? You don't stay there, but you can't ignore it.
Yeah. Well, we said before we came out here that this time was gonna go by quickly. We were kind of like, are we even gonna need the cards? Can we make this a conversation?
We didn't even look at them.
And I was like, we need the cards so we can stay on track. But all of that to say, I do believe that we have an opportunity. If we don't go around it, but as you say, we go through it. And I think that is, in so many ways, the invitation for the work ahead. It's how do we build and how do we work in a way that is focused, is like we truly want to win. And for everyone who's here, with us in the audience, for those of you who are watching, I urge you to sort of visit colorofchange.org, visit the African American Policy Forum, check out the work that is happening with both of our organizations, ways to get involved, trainings, other ways to both raise your voice, joining efforts that focus on fighting back. Building and turning defense into offense. There's so much we can do, and I believe there's so much that we can win.
How are you feeling after the end of CRT summer school? Energized? Renewed? Informed? Well, that's amazing because most of you only saw a quarter of summer school.
There is so much to watch now that it's all on demand and right at your fingertips. It's not too late to register to check out AAPF's CRT Summer School On Demand Library.
In July of this year, bringing together over 175 faculty members, we witnessed timely analysis and uplifted vital conversations which spanned the gamut. From the challenges faced in public education, the role that faith communities must play to defend anti-racism, to how DEI can continue under increasingly difficult conversations. And we are giving you access to all of this amazing content.
Whether it's to better inform yourself, to share with friends and family, or to use in your own anti-racist teaching, the 2022 CRT Summer School On Demand Library provides vital resources for understanding our present political crisis. Now more than ever, we must come together as a multiracial, multi-generational community to fight for our rights and our lives. The right to envision a truly inclusive, multiracial democracy for all.
If you want access to this powerful and illuminating content, follow the link below and sign up while this information is as urgent and as necessary as ever. You don't want to miss this as we turn the voices of hundreds into thousands.
So we've got some questions. And we also can't go all night. So
all right, let's time ourselves. How long do we want to take on these?
Oh God, I'm the worst one with this.
Well, obviously I am too. So we are not disciplining each other at all.
I don't know. All right. Okay. We'll just do our best.
We'll do our best. All right.
You see this lack of commitment to rules here?
Yes, exactly.
You see this? You see we're no.
One more thing.
So what content outside the classroom was most impactful in shaping your understanding of Black history?
My mama. It was my mom. I was born and raised in the town that she was born and raised in. And my mother she integrated the local swimming pool when she was 3. And thought it was important that she show me where things happened, right? So we would drive by, and our town was one of those towns that closed the swimming pool rather than integrated. So she would drive by the pool. She said, that's where I was when my mom put me in the water. And I was splashing around, and they drained the pool while I was in there. So she would show me that. She would drive me by the soda fountain that didn't want to serve her. And when they were sued, they just closed down their fountain and just started selling candy. Or she would show me the Palace Theater where she wasn't allowed to sit in the front. The usher would come and stand in front of her and try to force her into the peanut gallery. So my mom was... I guess an archaeologist for me. She said, you are standing on ground that has been framed and structured on anti-Black racism. So for her and for me, I learned about this stuff before I got to school. So as I was going through grade school and high school and college and law school, for me, it was like, where is the stuff that I know happened not showing up in the curriculum? And why is it not showing up in the curriculum? And what should we do about it? Which is where critical race theory came from. So now I got one for you. And I think I know where this one came from. How do you see the fight for algorithmic justice in the context of racial justice, given the Biden, the Black tech agenda?
There's so much about algorithmic justice, about AI. I hope people see. Have anyone seen this movie, Coded Bias? We've got the star of Coded Bias here, right?
Emmy nominee.
Emmy nominee, right? Yes. All right. Algorithmic bias is like one of the core tenets of the Black tech agenda, and we address it in a number of ways, both through forcing transparency, visibility, evaluation from government. Algorithms are decision-making vehicles that are built by people that create opportunity or prevent opportunity, create consequences, prevent consequences, open doors or close doors, and folks are able to make them and pretend like there's nothing that nothing about their identity or their belief system or their trajectory had anything to do with the building and the structuring of it. And part of what we really try to do at Color of Change is hold the line between real solutions and fake solutions. Mm-hmm. And far too often, when it comes to things that happen across the board as it relates to race, but particularly when it relates to tech, we get a lot of fake solutions rooted in putting the onus on users to game systems or to prevent the harm that's being done to them. It would be like kind of saying, we're going to put spoiled meat next to healthy meat, and we're gonna put it all in the same counter, and because we want to give the consumer choice, right? Like that is not really, that wouldn't be acceptable. But somehow we take those same frameworks and we allow that to sort of operate how we do business when it comes to technology. And so I don't think that anything about algorithmic bias, anything about the challenges as it relates to tools and the frameworks that are built in Silicon Valley will be solved by Silicon Valley. I do not believe that the people who created the problem have the incentive structure, the know-how, the expertise, or the moral integrity to actually solve these problems. And so we need accountability. And this country has, had a different level of history with it, but when more people have been invested in holding corporations accountable, we've been able to get new things. And part of the Black Tech agenda is, in so many ways, is to hold that line between real solutions and fake solutions. Because when it comes to technology, people all of a sudden want to start creating new ways of solving problems that are created by corporations, that are created by greed, and are created in the name of innovation, but to harm sort of so many people. And so that's the work. And I believe it is one of the true racial justice issues of our time. It impacts every single other issue we care about, and we have to win on this, despite the money that platforms will want to invest in civil rights organizations, despite the money they will spend on the airs trying to confuse us into believing that that regulation will hurt their innovation. Their innovation is hurting our ability to live and flourish.
All right.
Prior to these anti-CRT laws, what stories or which figures did you feel were most missing from your curriculum growing up?
Oh, well, clearly Black women. I mean, I could go through a whole list, but I think perhaps the best way to concretize the consequences of erasure is to point out that one of the reasons that we ended up with Clarence Thomas on the Supreme Court, there's a whole story to be told there, but I often say that's a self-inflicted wound, because Clarence Thomas ended up securing his seat on the Supreme Court after Anita Hill came forward to testify about sexual harassment, largely due to the fact that the few Southern senators who relied on Black votes were getting calls from their Black constituents that ran 7-8 to 1 in favor of confirmation after Anita Hill came forward, right? They went from being kind of split to totally for him. And then why was that? When Anita Hill came forward to talk about sexual harassment, in many quarters in the Black community, the conversation was, sexual harassment is a white woman's issue. Anita Hill's acting like a white woman. This is the same thing that we've seen before. It's a high-tech lynching for African-American men who, in Clarence Thomas's terms, deemed to think for themselves. Now, what does this have to do with the history that's missing? Sexual harassment has been a condition of Black women's work life since we arrived here. That's what enslavement was called. Sexual harassment has been part of Black women's lives working as domestics since we were liberated. Sexual harassment continues to be a central part of Black women's lives. The fact that people didn't know it and therefore couldn't recognize what Anita Hill was talking about as deeply rooted in Black women's experience is what contributed to Black people thinking that they needed to support Clarence Thomas. Now, the consequence of that lost history, including the fact that Rosa Parks got her start in politics, in organizing, by supporting a Black woman who had been not only sexually harassed, but raped. People don't know that story. All they know is when she refused to give up her seat. So imagine what our politics would look like, how different it would be if we knew the full story of Rosa Parks,
Yeah.
or if we knew the full story of Fannie Lou Hamer, who was sterilized, we wouldn't have racial anti-racism here, feminism there. We wouldn't be constantly trying to integrate, because our anti-racism was integrated from the beginning. We just don't know it because we weren't taught it, and because we weren't taught it, we perform against it. That is the consequence, having this particular person on the Supreme Court.
When I told you you all were in for a treat with Kim, you're in for a treat. What Kim didn't say was that she was part of and one of the leaders of the legal team supporting Anita Hill, which is just one of the many pieces of your biography that continues to celebrate, and a reminder of how ahead of us you constantly were. So where you lead, my friend, I will follow. Thank you so much for this time, and thank you all for being with us.